And there we go. So Brandy Agerbeck, welcome to Nova Scribes. How's it going?
It's going well. I'm very thankful to be here.
Nice. It's nice to have you. So we're here to talk about your book, The Idea Shapers. Now, this was not your first book. So your first book, Graphic Facility, do you want to talk a little bit about that one before we jump into this one?
Sure. So the uh all of the you have both books to thank from a dream I had in Auckland, New Zealand, like a literal dream. I had been co-creating a book with a good friend of mine named Pamela Meyer, a book called Permission, sweet little book about giving yourself permission, taking permission. And that was purely a exercise in learning about self-publishing. She had traditionally published, had a couple frustrations with it, so we were learning together. Fantastic collaboration, the rare, like, seamless collaboration that's just the best ever. And we paused production when I went away to New Zealand for 3 weeks. One night I had a dream. I was formatting a book about graphic facilitation. Actually, what I call the Essential Eight, which I would teach before IFEP conferences when I taught the 101 sessions with Lynn Carruthers. And I could see myself laying out those concepts in a book, and in the dream, I could feel how successful it was. So I woke up at about 4 a.m. staring at an Airbnb ceiling, and I went, I guess I'm writing a book. And then I toddled off to a cafe that afternoon and had a circular argument with myself, which was, I should write the book about graphic facilitation because that's a thing people know me for. But I really want to write the book about visual thinking for everybody. But I really should write the book about graphic facilitation. So literally it was like, okay, write the graphic facilitation book first, get it out of the way. Now, I love the book. I'm very proud of the book. It's not like an aside. I put lots of hard work in that book, but for me, it was like, let's get to the book that, like, is for every job title and everything you could possibly want to tackle with visual thinking. So, but it all came from that dream and got sketched out in a messy drawing in an Auckland cafe, in a cafe in Auckland. That's
What
where I was born.
impresses me about that is that you went through the pain and suffering of writing one book, and then you're like, let's do it again, which is amazing. No?
So, number one advice for anyone who wants to write a book, and that's exactly what I had first with my collaboration with Pamela, and then with the Graphic Facilitators Guide. Do not make the book your first book, because there's so much learning curve on producing a book from concept all the way to execution. If you're self-publishing, there's that whole learning curve. So I was actually exceedingly thankful that the Graphic Facilitators Guide, I got to ride that learning, climb up that learning curve so that I could really tackle the second one for everybody.
Is this the book then? This is the one that you always wanted to write?
This is the book I was put on the planet to write.
Okay. Why? You want to talk a little bit about it? Because there's so much in here, but what was it that was driving you to write this one?
It really was knowing from firsthand experience how amazing visual thinking is. For me, visual thinking is a big, gorgeous umbrella that does contain specific things like sketch notes, specific job titles like graphic facilitation, but truly that giant umbrella that holds all of it. And knowing how much it really helps us clarify our thinking and how much it helps reduce overwhelm, and just like these basic things, getting our stuff out onto surfaces so we can think and feel and process and all those fantastic things. And understanding that it's very abstract, it's intangible until you make it tangible. It's very complex. So it was a matter of knowing how powerful a tool it was, but trying to create a very concrete bridge between, I feel like this would help me, and now I know all the tools to make it happen.
Yeah. So one of the things that struck me as I was reading this is that it's organized very, very well, using this kind of hand model as a mnemonic. Again, grasp, chunk, sort and group, connect and contain, and then finally scale. And I got this sense that you really wanted this to be something that people could pull out of their heads at a moment's notice. Is that right?
That's absolutely right.
Okay. So
So
how did you
it
come up
does,
with Go ahead.
just order wise.
Yeah.
We start with chunk, then we sort and group, then we connect and contain, then we use scale. And lastly, with doing all those four things, we get to grasp that
Got it.
thumb. We get to grasp our ideas in new ways.
Okay.
You got it.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
So how did you come up with the idea of calling it the idea shapers? That was something that came out like really early in the book. What is an
Yep.
idea shaper?
An idea shaper is really those tools that help you get your hands on your ideas, that help you push things around on the page so you can figure out how the pieces fit together. Julie Gasicki, so you may notice, or you might notice because I'm not going to explain this well. I've talked a lot today and I might run out of words. I'll try not to. Um, there isn't the words visual thinking on the cover of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually working on the book, and Julie Kasicki said, what if it didn't say visual thinking on the cover? Since very few of us even know what the heck those two words mean. And even if we have a definition, my definition may be different than your definition. And so I went, oh my gosh, what if drawing wasn't on the book and visual thinking wasn't on the cover of the book? What would convey the message I wanted to convey? And
Yeah.
so I just love this, this more kinesthetic, squishy, you're shaping your ideas. And it really is, when you put these tools in your hands, it's giving you more of a sense of agency,
Mhm.
more of a sense of, I can figure this stuff out. I've got the tools to work through my ideas.
Yeah, I love it. And by the way, if you've got your copy of the book with you, I'll tell you, I'm on page 11 right now. So this is something that what occurred to me is that this was, so you said that this isn't just visual thinking, this is thinking, right? These are tools to help people conceptualize and grasp their ideas. I love how you say you don't have to be an artist to draw a full stop, right? So let's zoom out on that just for a second. I've noticed that in our industry, there seem to be a little bit kind of two schools of thought. One of them is that you always want to have say a graphic facilitator or a graphic recorder in the room to be the scribe, and then there's others who have more of, let's say, a kind of an egalitarian view of it, whereas like, let's put the markers in the hands of the participants, and so they're up there and they're drawing. I'm wondering where you stand on that spectrum.
Honestly, it's an and.
Mhm.
I definitely don't sit in one camp or the other. Um, I think what we do as specialized professionals, and also the fact that most all of us are outsiders, so we get to listen with those outsider ears. We're not caught up in the politics and the dynamics of the meeting. I think that really gives us a special perspective. And there's absolutely times where, when I'm working with a new client and we're talking through the agenda, if I see a portion where I can see that the group is going to get farther faster if we give them the markers, let's talk about, are you willing to change the design? Are you willing to shift this so that we can get everyone using the tools instead of just, the
Yeah.
one person
So it's
with
a
the job
both and.
title.
All right.
Exactly.
By the way, I love this next progression. I'm just going to walk through it, right? I love how you introduce
Awesome.
Ken Wilber's AQAL model. And if you're not familiar with it, it's just a way of considering. It's a way of saying, all right, here's how might we look at this from different perspectives. So it starts with the I, the interior individual, the it, the exterior individual, the we, the interior collective, and then the it's, the exterior collective. And this is what you do that's so cool with this thing, is that you use it really as your basis to say, all right, how might we represent these things, looking at it from that same sort of quad, eventually turning it into something like this. So this is, I mean, I just geek out on models and frameworks and something like that. Can you walk us through this one?
Sure. Really, it's, just building on what you just referenced, Brian, about you don't have to be an artist to draw. The first corner I introduce is that upper right-hand corner, which is drawing to see. That is representational drawing. That is the corner that freaks people out. And I was introduced to this model from a facilitator I worked with for years. She brought me Ken Wilber's book called A Theory of Everything. Big title, big ambitions. It shares, if you like frameworks, first he starts with this model, and then he shares Beck and Cohen's spiral dynamics model, which has like been a lifeline for me to try to make sense of of everything. And I had really enjoyed both those models, but I was thinking about, how do I help people have a broader definition of drawing? Because so often we think capital A art, capital M masterpiece. Unfortunately, there's a lot of thoughts that like certain people are tapped on the head with the talent stick, and if you don't have the talent, don't even try. Of
Mhm.
course, I don't believe any of this. I do think, it's all about practice. It's all about systematically learning new skills, like super learnable. But we start in that corner because, again, that's the narrow definition people have. But when I layer on 4 reasons to draw on top of Ken Wilber's model, the fantastic thing is we get two types of drawing that are more product focused. So that it's funny, the book is black and white, but I always think of drawing to see as the blue corner. And the lower left-hand corner, which is drawing to show, is the red corner. Those are two types of drawings that do need to be more accurate and refined to be effective in what they do.
Okay,
Yeah,
so wait, so do that again,
go
because
ahead.
now I'm going to go back and color it. So this is the blue
Yep.
one. Okay.
That one's red.
Oh,
No, that's blue. I'm sorry.
this
I said
one's
the
blue.
wrong thing.
Okay.
That one's blue. Yep.
And then this one's the
The
red one.
bottom, that one's red. You
Okay.
got it.
Do
The
these have a
dew,
color?
yeah, think is yellow.
Pink is yellow. Okay.
Yep. And dew is green.
It's green. Of course it is.
Yep. Of course it is, right? So those two types of drawing are more product focused. So for instance, in drawing to show, if you're creating imagery for a specific group, you need to make imagery that's going to speak to that particular audience.
Mhm.
So knowing, is there like some simple things like branding, like consistency and branding, so folks know they're in the right place, or there's a consistent look and feel to something. Is it the kind of stylistically, is it something that's going to attract that audience? But my happy place is the other two corners, the yellow corner and the green corner, because those two types of drawings are more processed focused, and they're actually better when they're fast and messy.
Mhm. Yeah, I love it. How did you,
Yeah.
I just got to ask this, especially on a black and white book. And then there's a whole other chapter that's on color in a black and white book, which must have been, I can't imagine what it was like to design that. How did you come up with these particular color assignments for these functions?
Well, I knew I wanted my favorite ones to be yellow and green because I love yellow and green.
Huh? That's a good answer.
And right. And I think that that color yellow, just that sense of like light and knowledge, like I just have a really, very much what I put on the cover of the book. Like I definitely associate the color yellow with insight, knowledge, just light.
Yeah. Okay. So can I tell
Yeah.
you, when you just did that, here's the super geek in my head just lit up, because when I read this, I associated it with the four temperaments, which is something that's like fundamentally about personality. And those are the colors. When you actually, there is an assessment out there called the PACE palette, which you can take, which will tell you what your preferred temperament is, and it matches up with these colors exactly. So really, and so one of the things that's kind of interesting about the temperaments is that you find it, conscious or not, just threaded through humanity. I mean, we're talking about like collective unconsciousness stuff.
Yep.
Not to geek out too hard, but I got real excited when you say that.
No, I love those kind of systems. So I just wrote down PACE palette. What is the yellow temperament? If I may interrupt for a sec.
The yellow temperament would be the sanguine. It's the one that is a little bit more focused on action, energy, that kind of thing, like getting your hands on stuff, right? Like being in the moment, that kind of thing, which, there you go. That's
Perfect.
Yeah, right. So, and then I found this one, which was also just really cool. I was like, the text, okay, that's fine. It's fun to read this stuff. But then you see this, it's like, oh, this is cool. So how about this one? The property and powers of drawing.
This was just talking about what is inherent in the act of drawing that makes it such a great way to process your own feelings, process information, figure stuff out. And the first one is, it's simple. Really, all you need is paper and pen. I know in this group, there might be folks who really love digital tools. Personally, this is my kind of digital. It's so direct. It's so physical. Like this ties in, this connects to physical. But really, the materials are simple. It is the learning the thinking skills that's the part that's more complex, thus the book. But there really isn't anything that needs to get in your way. Like you can use any freaking scrap of paper you have and anything that'll make a mark. Like really,
yeah,
it's that, it's that direct. And then the next is physical. So one of the a big reason I personally prefer physical materials to digital materials is I think it helps us draw us more into our body. Whereas whenever we're using a digital tool, we're always trying to fit our thinking through a menu. So it's always being abstracted into a menu. And when we stay more in our own body, we're going to pick up on a whole lot of physical cues. So noticing, I'm writing this out right now and it's so tense and I'm not happy about it, but that's information. Or you have a moment where, something clicks into place and you might get goosebumps or that, wave of relief. that's information. So I think that there's a whole lot in the physical making of it that is really useful information.
Yeah.
And then tangible, this is where we're taking that stuff that's abstract. I like to think about where, I tend to keep company with high achievers, people who like to learn a lot, like to do a lot. I'm sensing this is who shows up here for Nova Scribe meetups. So we tend to like hold a whole lot in our heads, and it's amazing how much we like take in and take in and take in and try to move around the world. All the information and feelings and thoughts and ideas we're trying to hold inside. When we get that stuff out, there's that sense of relief.
Mm-hmm.
There's that reducing overwhelm. I see Sherry nodding at that one in my gallery view. Totally. And it's just getting it out and making stuff tangible. And even if something's only arm's length, there is that new perspective you get, just that little bit of distance from whatever it was you were holding on to.
Yeah.
And it's not as if you're not going to fill up again. But the great thing is you can always go back to another piece of paper and do it all over again. That's that, get back to that simple part. And then lastly, spatial, you can go in any direction on the page.
Mm-hmm.
It's still two-dimensional, but how we can show different types of relationships and how pieces fit together is vastly more flexible than good old linear words.
Exactly. You show like 3D people in 3D space, which is the idea, rather than, and you have this later in the book, but rather than that single dimensionality, if you're taking notes just linearly as you do when you're reading or writing, versus this way when you can really go out in the whole, I think you said it, the remaining 359 angles that you can actually pursue out, right? Yeah,
exactly.
So there's a couple things that are coming up for me around this one. So the one is just the physicality of it, right? Like the kinesthetic nature of it. How have you found, since we're hopefully on the backside of COVID, to what extent have you found yourself like doing more of like the digital, the virtual, and then within that, what difference has it made in terms of that keeping things kinesthetic and tangible and real for your participants?
Yeah, great questions. I personally, because I am in the space of teaching people visual thinking versus visually thinking for folks. As far as graphic facilitation went, I really wasn't pitching that as like, I wasn't trying to adjust my practice to be digital and virtual, that part of my practice. I've had a couple projects. One thing that's interesting is just right around the corner there, I have one of those Captivo cameras.
Yeah.
Do you know what yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this, for anyone it's a camera that's an arm that comes out from the wall above the drawing. It's designed for whiteboards, but it works perfectly fine with good old paper and markers. And it takes footage of you as you draw, but it removes you from the photo. So it's kind of like this magic drawing that kind of just appears as you're drawing. And, I'm thankful I have it. And when I have had client projects, I would say to them, we can either use the Captivo camera, where kind of like the drawing is revealed, or we can use this webcam and you can see me making the drawing. And every client, not that it's a huge sample size, but every client has said, no, we want to see you making the drawing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of showing up as a whole human being and serving other humans. Like, no, I wasn't strong arming, no twisted arms, but that's, where they've all come down. And I just think that's a good sign of showing up as whole humans.
Yeah, I can add a little bit of data to that. So I found that, even if I'm using an iPad and Procreate, and I give them the option to do like a little picture in picture so that people can see a behind the scenes, they really want to see that behind the scenes too. Not just seeing the artifact show up. They want to, it's like they want the open kitchen, right? To see the cooks preparing the meal. Yeah.
Totally. Awesome.
Okay. And then the other thing that you said was about the way that I interpreted it was something around memory, right? That there's so many great ideas that happen, especially if you're in, a participatory decision-making process, that it's tough for any one person to hold all of that stuff. I like to say that my limit is around 3. I can remember 3 things at a time. Like more than that, I got to write this down, right? Mm-hmm. So have you found that, is there, does it just kind of grease the wheels of the process when people see their ideas captured? Is there some validation that's go there? Yeah. What have you found with that?
Yeah, this is definitely the green book. So by the way, the books are color coded to the corners they live in. Oh, cool. So talking about geeking out about color. So the green book is green because it's drawing to do. The yellow book is yellow because it's drawing to think. Um, when we're talking specifically about visuals and working with groups, I talk about 3 giant powers of when we show up and draw 4 groups of people, and that's the power of being listened to. Think about how many people show up to a meeting with, their answer in their back pocket and they're just waiting to speak, right? It's like, oh, I know what we need to do. And they're not really listening to anybody else until then they say their idea. And Joe, I'm glad you're with me on the color meeting. That's awesome. And then the great thing is once they say that thing and I capture that thing, then they're open up to actually listening, to everyone else, right? So the first thing is just that the validation. We're human validation machines. I think for folks who feel really intimidated by doing work as a scribe, and they feel all this pressure, I'm like, no, you don't understand.
Yeah.
You listen to people for a living. They love you. So the first is power being listened to. Second is shared understanding. That is where there is definitely that alchemy that the sum is absolutely greater than the parts when we are fitting those different pieces together. And showing the patterns and showing the connections. And then the third is seeing and touching your work. I think that idea of there's no question how productive this meeting was when they're surrounded by their charts.
Right.
And there's also so much memory embedded into each one of those charts. Like I love it when somebody goes, that idea was somewhere over there, right? Like they know exactly where to look to find that because there is so much embedded in that chart. And this is a big reason why what our chart does in the room is not what it does when you then share that chart with people outside the room, because they just didn't have all of that experience built in. And you're nodding. You're with me.
They didn't have the context. They don't have the same. They didn't see it being created. They don't have the same. So one of your idea shapers is the anchor, right? So the anchor of what that image was back to the whole conversation that represented it, they're not there. Yep. I personally, I think that there's just no comparison between, I'll call it traditional facilitation that doesn't have a visual component and facilitation does have a visual component, just because otherwise the words that people say, they tend to be just vapor, right? And people forget, and they're waiting to, as you said, kind of empty their backpack of whatever it is that they're bringing into the room, and the listening just isn't happening. All right,
cool. I think what you were just I love how Rachel said this in the chat, using the room as agenda and memory. I think that's like that super spatial, wonderful element when we are in physical rooms together, which I do miss that part. But you just said, Brian, the vapor, I think, what, and you describing being able to hold 3 things. You think about every single participant in that room, they're taking in new information. They might be learning something new, like a new framework that we're trying to put our work into. And they're distracted by everything they left at their desk to come into the meeting. They're thinking about the next deadline. They're thinking about their family. Like, you just think about all that cognitive overload. And, so just being able to have folks dedicated to capture and, the processing and synthesis, there is no comparison, truly.
Right.
And how it helps us.
So Sherry says in chat, another reason to plug in-person recording versus behind the scenes sketchnoting that is only available after an event. Thanks. Absolutely. If you're not part of the process, then it has less meaning for you.
Totally.
So we touched on digital, and I wanted to hit this specifically because it was important enough for you to put like a box around it, and highlight this thing.
Which page is that?
What's it? Oh, I'm sorry. I should
what
be
page?
29, right?
Got it.
It was page 29. In the 21st century, we all look at screens all day. Every day, we've trained ourselves to tune out those screens or zone out in front of those screens. Also, many screen orientations put us in a linear thinking mode, either scrolling up and down or swiping left and right. Okay, so it was kind of, it's a little bit of a kind of a knock on the digital, right? So since you've been forced into it, though, have you changed your mind?
It's like so many things, like good old PowerPoint that people love to hate on. It's the tool. Yeah. Like to your earlier question about the experience, I love teaching virtually. Love it. Love it more than I thought I would love it. And it's about designing for that type of experience. And it's about sending a physical kit of physical materials that folks are going to use during that event and after that event. So I think it's, I do think we have been trained, and unfortunately, as we see, social media just gets more and more and more towards, the goldfish what is it, 6-second memory?
Yeah.
Where are we at now? We are physically training ourselves to be, dopamine junkies and overload ourselves. So the fact that we're totally again, my preference is physical materials,
Yeah.
switching mediums, giving ourselves that quiet and that space. Yeah, it's another tool, but again, it's just look at how we've trained ourselves to use different tools. Can we shake up the current use of how we're using tools?
Yeah.
Certainly. Absolutely.
So
It's just a
Rachel and
matter
I
of
actually have a
design.
shared client where they're like, okay, we want you to come and facilitate for us, but you're not allowed to use sticky notes. We had a bad experience with sticky notes. You're not allowed to use sticky notes. And we're like, no, you had a bad experience with a facilitator, right? It's not about the sticky notes. So yeah, to your point, I think, it's about the tool.
Did they tell you what happened with these sticky notes?
It was like too many
now,
sticky notes, sticky note overload, didn't really synthesize type thing. Yeah, it
right.
just sounded like it wasn't really well, because they did it themselves, quite frankly. They didn't have a facilitator.
Yeah.
So I want to jump into the actual the idea shapers themselves, right?
Excellent.
And this was such a cool thing. So I got this was I've never seen this dichotomy before, but it's like as soon as I saw it, it was like, oh, of course, right? This is it. So directed drawings on the one hand, where useful when your objective has a clearer given parameters, and then emergent drawings, which are more open-ended, allows for discovery and can be made more directed later if needed, right? And
Yep.
what was so cool about this is that I've seen this. So one of the other things that you shared on Nova Scribes is that kind of spectrum of organization, right? And I was thinking, okay, well, the emergent drawings, that's more like a popcorn, I think, to use your word for it, where you're just kind of like popping
That's one shape
information around.
Yep.
And then with a more directed, certainly there's more like structure there, right? Could you talk a little bit about this, just because I think it's such a cool dichotomy?
Yeah, I think it's and I love that it also, we're talking about the pace palette, or you're describing two types of people with their attitude about the work of the room. This is something that sprang out of turning the book into the online course. Is I sort of came up with two types of people. People tend to be more of a messy Mel, where it's like, this is weird, it's messy, I don't care, like that comfort in a big blank page and not knowing what's going to emerge. And then there's Tidy Tilda, who is like, I need there to be 3 points, and each of the 3 points has to have 3 points under it, like lining things up and making sure everything's orderly. And Sharon's already messy Mel, right? And I share those two, and I share these two types of drawing. Directed drawing, very much the Tidy Tilda. I need to know what shape I'm trying to fill. Like, this needs to be structured, this needs to have edges. That's the comfort zone. And then messy Mel is like, okay, give me a blank sheet of paper, let's just figure out where this goes. So being, kind of, very much along for the ride. And the idea between the two of them is each has different functions. My main reason for defining messy Mel and Tidy Tilda and defining emergent drawings versus directed drawings is giving ourselves that space to let things emerge. I think the worst case scenario, and probably plenty of people here have experienced this, is when you're in a meeting and folks like, okay, now we're going to spend the next 40 minutes working on a SWOT analysis. So, we draw that big 2x2 matrix, we label each corner. And worst case scenario, people are like, basically like, okay, let's fill something into each of these, and then I'm going to go get coffee.
Yeah.
Right. Their thinking doesn't go any farther than, these are the blanks on the assignment, I'm going to fill in the blanks.
Right.
Right. So that's when we have a directed drawing that really shuts down thinking, because we're truly just filling in the blanks.
Right.
And can totally recognize that a conversation that's open-ended, my favorite part of any agenda is when they say, okay, for the next 90 minutes, we're just going to talk through this complex thing. And I'm like, yes.
Right. Yeah.
I have no idea what the shape of that's going to be, but I know it's going to emerge, and I'm going to have this wonderful opportunity to, show the shape of it. I'm not sure I answered your question, Brian.
No, you actually expanded it a little bit, which is even better. That's a very emergent thing to do, which is great. I will tell you, I'm more kind of a directed kind of guy, right? Because I think overlapping all of this is that you could lay, for example, from the Myers-Briggs, judging and perceiving, or being more open or closed in your thinking, or divergence and convergence, which is another one that we play with, or even like ideating and then refining, right? That this is where we're actually gonna be on the line of inquiry versus the line of advocacy over here, right? And I think that
great parallels.
Yeah, and that you can use this as a way of just saying, okay, well, if you happen to fall into either of those camps, you might be a little bit more comfortable over here. Like I love me some templates because it's like, okay, I'm going to structure my thinking in this way, right?
Yep. Yep.
So, whoops, oh,
Totally.
I lost the page. Oh, and by the way, I haven't been calling out page numbers. I got to get better at that. But
Yeah, Pedro's right on saying you can be messy Mel when creating or brainstorming, then tidy Tilda when organizing ideas. Now,
yeah,
the main thing is that just don't force yourself to be tidy too soon because you're not giving yourself the space to figure stuff out. That's
right.
the main thing.
Yeah.
Also, it's a great way to help quiet that inner critic, to quiet the perfectionism, which I know a whole heck of a lot of us
Yeah.
live with and manage all the time.
You know, you had mentioned that you really like to hang out with high performers. I think that a lot of the times in our sessions, in the work that we do, we find ourselves working with groups with very, very driven high performers. And it can be difficult to take those people who are like, all right, I just want to check that box. I want to plant that flag. I want to climb that hill. I want to declare success. And to say, well, let's hold the aperture open just a little bit more, right? Let's not just go with the first best idea. What happens if we explore this a little bit more and we come up with like the third or fourth or fifth or sixth good idea, right?
Totally. Absolutely.
Okay, so you jump, actually, do you want to talk a little bit about just the structure of the book? Because I don't know if you can go through all of the idea shapers.
That's too much.
Well,
That's overload.
I want to, there's a few that were so cool that I want to highlight, but do you want to talk about
Cool.
the way that this is organized?
Totally. So this definitely this is the challenge of writing a book, is taking a very nonlinear process and trying to line it up in pages. Even though I can work with structure and I can add illustrations, that was definitely one of the most challenging parts of this is, okay, what is the sequence that's going to help folks learn all these individual idea shapers? So they do have they fit within this five steps using the hand. And if anyone's curious about this, this is what I shared in my 2013 TEDx talk called Shape Your Thinking. That talk is at the 5-step level. And then later I developed the idea shape. I knew that's where I was going, but the idea shapers didn't exist at that point of that talk. So the idea is to break down one part of visual thinking to such a simple learnable piece that ideally when you look at that piece, you go, well, duh. You're like, wait, you put similar ideas near each other? What? So hopefully that's one of those ideas where you're like, well, that makes sense. That's learnable. So I start out with what the principle is. Then I go into some of the choices around that particular idea shaper and end each chapter with what I call at work. So the stack at work, to illustrate, to make it less abstract and more a story around somebody using that specific, is focusing more on that specific idea shaper, though they're all kind of tied together. So there's 24 idea shapers. And so each chapter starts with, here's the here's the thing, here are your choices that get it more sophisticated and, help teach you what you can do with that blank sheet of paper. And then again, ending with a story.
So I'm just going to tell you, like, my next job when I'm done on this call is I'm gonna take each one of these idea shapers and I'm gonna just make a card out of them. I don't know if you've thought of making cards, but boy, I'd be your first customer, right? I mean, just to like lay this out and say, you know what, at this moment, bam, we're gonna do this thing. Let's do a
Yep.
stack here. Did you ever think of that?
I have. It just is one of those things that's not completed yet. But yes, the last 3 days, I have a upcoming workshop about faces and figures. So I
Oh
just
yeah,
made an expressions deck.
so
So
cool.
the expressions deck is at the printers right now.
I like that guy in the
So
end.
I understand. I'm a big fan of cards.
Oh, me
It's the
too.
stack. That's the
Yeah,
idea shaper, the stack.
the cool thing about, yeah, it's the stack, is the cool thing about like cards is you can spread them all out all over the table. You can see them all at once and say, okay, we're going to do this and then this. Yeah.
Totally.
So I loved this one. So here's what I'd like to do.
Mhm.
I went through them, with totally non-scientifically. I just like, oh, that one's really cool. I never thought of that one before, right? So I want to just touch on the few idea shapers that just struck me. And if anybody wants to share theirs, you can drop it into chat. The first one I wanted to touch on was it's on page 87, the retort, right? And the kind of the metaphor that you use for it is this, like, I don't know, distilling beaker, this decanter type thing.
Yep.
And I love how you've got like you've got your objective here, right? That's really like the fuel to this fire. And then you've got all your sources, all your ideas, and then the salient points are the ones that kind of distill up along the top edge of this thing. And then pop, you've got your ahas, the clear, concise chunk of information. And I thought this was so cool because I've seen this like represented almost like an iceberg. What are those
Mhm.
things that like rise to the top? But I'd never seen this before as a metaphor. Talk about the retort a little bit. Like, what is it? How much you use it? Help me out with this one.
So this, we very briefly before we started the session today, we're loving up John Ward,
Oh yeah.
and you have John Ward to thank for that particular model, because that is one of the few things that are in both books. And when I was talking about distilling, what we do in the room when we're, I know every person thinks every word they say is precious and important. And we know that's not true. There's a whole lot of ebb and flow and ums and ahs and summary and detail. And I was talking to John Ward about this, and he goes, well, it's kind of like an alembic, the retort, that piece of glassware that distills. I'm like, you are absolutely right. So I thanked him on that page in the graphic facilitators guide, and then I couldn't not have it in this book as well. Really, it is that idea that, well, certainly when we're working with groups, if your goal is to, well, okay, this applies both to being a scribe in the room, working with groups, also applies to a way a lot of folks approach sketchnoting,
Mhm.
is the folks who capture and they go for quantity. And I don't know how many folks here were like a really amazing note taker in school where you filled pages and pages and pages of notes. And then maybe you went back to those notes and you're like, you look at them and you're like, you didn't even feel like you were in class. Does that resonate with anybody? I can only see so many people, and thank you. Sherry's giving me a little bit of a nod. Rachel, give me a thumbs up. Not to force the issue if that's not your experience, but very often when we're in that mode, we're treating ourselves like a recording device.
Mhm.
So we're not actually listening for meaning. We're not listening. We're not collecting ideas and waiting to see how those different ideas go together. So the retort is one of those first steps in that discernment between, first it's discernment. What is it I want to capture? What is it I don't want to capture? So if I'm sitting down with that piece of paper and I'm trying to work on one thing and all these other thoughts are coming in, no, I'm discerning and deciding those don't belong in this particular drawing.
Right.
The second part is then distilling the language, simplify, like short, part of it's shorter statements just because they're faster to write. Part of it's shorter statements so you have more room on the page. But really it's that processing of the information versus being that recording device.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so what's coming up for me, and I'm noticing in chat, Pedro says I try to synthesize versus record. I'll tell you, this is really hard for me because the thing is that in order to synthesize, right, you really have to kind of wrap your head around it. You got to soak it in. You have to percolate on it for a second. You got to say, all right, here's what this means to me. Here's how I can attach this to my own mental models. And, if I'm doing a good job as a visual note taker, here's how I might channel that into a picture of some kind, right?
Mhm.
And by the time I've done all of that kind of mental gymnastics, I've missed like 20 points that somebody's just said, right? So this is the question that you get all the time, right? But how do you do both at the same time? How do you synthesize, which is an internal process, and listen and record, which is another internal process?
Yep. First, and this definitely connects back to the last session I did with you all, which was about that spectrum of organization. First, sometimes the content you're working with isn't really synthesizable.
Hmm.
So trying to force everything to being synthesized isn't necessarily the case. I think of like, brainstorming sessions where it's more just about everything living on the same level. We don't want any hierarchy. We don't want any organization. We just want this gorgeous cloud when we're diverging,
Yeah.
this gorgeous cloud of ideas. So first, just to say, not everything needs to be synthesized or should be synthesized. Second is just being human and the fact that we all have different kind of processing speeds. I happen to have a like crazy, crazy fast brain, for better or for worse. Thankfully, it's been really well applied as a graphic facilitator. And there's plenty of folks who say, I can't do that in the moment. Let me back up. Maybe I make a second document or refine this drawing. So just to recognize that, like my husband, super smart, slower processor, like
Mhm.
doesn't mean he's slow in the worst way, like worst use of that term. It truly is just, he needs some time to work it out, and recognizing that if I run over him like a race car, now we're getting into like couples therapy here, but just recognizing that processing speed. And this is something that's gotten really clear with being able to teach within my membership community. we had a deep dive day around listening that came from conversations we were having about this exact question.
Mhm.
My belief is, again, breaking down these skills into learnable pieces, something like color. I have a very specific way I teach color. You start with 3 colors, each one has a job. The idea is that if you practice just that and you've got that down, how much attention does that need in the moment?
Yeah.
Very little,
Yeah.
right? Distilling, if you just practice and practice and practice, and all you're doing, the only choice you're making is what do I want to capture and how do I distill it? Focusing in on that practice. How much attention do you need in the moment doing that? Less and less and less. So the more we practice some of these things, it might feel like practicing scales, as a musician, some of the stuff that doesn't feel like terribly exciting. The thing is, anytime you practice some of the visual choices that are extremely practicable, the more space we have in the moment, that is that room for organizing, that is that room for synthesizing.
That's very helpful. So it becomes almost automatic and you don't have to think about it. In chat, it looks like Pedro says, if you focus on the key concepts versus the details, it becomes easier to synthesize.
For sure. For sure. And
And
that's discerning. I don't need every single detail here.
then you
Sorry
have
to
this
cut you
whole
off, Brian.
section on penmanship, which seemed a little bit divergent to it, but I wanted to cover it just because it was so cool, right?
Yep.
This is, Heather, earmuffs. This is some of the best advice to somebody who's never even thought about penmanship before, just to take their really their lettering from where it is to where it should be, such that other people can look at it. So you talk about like the narrow space between letters, the kerning, just rounding things out, taking the time to slow down so that it's more legible, balancing speed and legibility, even getting into just a little bit of the art around it, around ascenders and excite and descenders. But I just thought that this was just great advice. I want to like just take this chapter out because it's just 2 or 3 pages on lettering. Say, okay, you want to get better at lettering? Read this. So how did this make it into a book around idea shapers? I guess is my question.
Because yeah, the retort does a couple different things, because it definitely talks about distilling and it also talks about how are you shaping letters on the page. It's that I think a lot of times when people think, if for folks who come to this kind of work, whatever direction, whatever doorway, sometimes folks think, oh, well, now that I'm getting really excited about visual tools, words are bad and images are good. It's like, no, 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 no. Visual thinking is words and images and symbols and arrows and shapes. Personally, I really de-emphasize imagery. That's actually a little tiny sliver of an iceberg at the back of the book. Yeah, it's another tool. It's another part of how we're expressing ourselves. So why not kind of share some ways to refine your handwriting? Because I think that is another one of those mindsets where people are like, oh, I can't even read my own handwriting. So people are like, they get like lazy with it, or just assume that's the only way they can write. And it's like, no, this is very practicable, extremely practicable. Just take some time.
And to your point about, which I think is what you're getting at around the de-emphasizing the visuals, emphasizing really the lettering, the content of it. Just the other day I was on Instagram just to give my ego that much more of a bruising, right? And I was looking at this one chart and my first reaction was, gosh, that was gorgeous. I don't even want to draw anymore. I mean, it was just amazing. And then I took another look at it, right? And it was really, really visually stunning. And it was synthesized down to like one word, just single words within banners, right? And there was amazing imagery and all of that around it, but it was so synthesized and distilled and I guess retorted, I suppose, that like I couldn't tell what was going on there. And I get that you need to be in the room in order to understand it, but like you need to have a little bit more of a memory anchor than that. You're nodding.
Yeah.
So what's coming up for you?
That's part of the first book, the Green Book. I talk about putting it together. That's the chapter about synthesis in the Graphic Facilitator's Guide. And I have a spectrum. This is kind of like the early iteration of what I shared in the last Nova Scribe session. So what Brian and I are referencing is a model called the visual organization scale. So it puts visual organization in some kind of spectrum, so we can see when do we want different types of different levels of information, levels of organization, and what we're doing. There we go. Finish that sentence. Okay. So And the earlier iteration of that was in the graphic facilitators guide called the synthesis spectrum. And I think it's got 5 steps, if I remember correctly. The 5th, oh, there we go. Beautiful. So this lives in a couple of my courses. This also is we have this video up, correct? Can we
It's up
link
there,
to?
yeah. There's a
Awesome.
recorded video.
Awesome. So absolutely watch the video. It's in a couple courses. It's in the anthology, World of Visual Facilitation, the big giant tome. So this is what my chapter's on. And where was I going with? Oh, in the graphic facilitators guide, again, I think it's 5 steps. And the 5th step is so far synthesized that it's removed from the details in the content. So I'm using a Aesop's fable as my example in that particular chapter, but the idea is that is a step so synthesized that the people in the room wouldn't feel understood. They wouldn't feel heard. They wouldn't recognize their experience in that drawing. In this model, that's step 7. That is something that would work brilliantly as a communication tool to summarize what we did over 3 days, or a great tool for talking to a wider audience of people who weren't there. But again, I think when we're in that role supporting a group of people, it's too far. It's too far synthesized for them to feel like their experiences have been captured.
This book is so big, I have to pick up my document camera so that it fits into it. So this is, if you happen to have this is on page 240 of this really, really big book, The World of Visual Facilitation. If you know what it is, you know what I'm talking about. All right. Thanks for that, Brandy. So I want to move on to another, boom, as that thing hits the ground. I want to move on to another one of the idea shapers, which is the flag. And I never really heard of it this way. I'd heard it called like bullets or something else. But I just thought that this was so cool. So develop your own reliable set of flags. So what is a flag? What's it do for you?
A flag is just a way of highlighting or separating out a point. And when it is bullets, that really is you're using some circle or square or consistent symbol. All you're doing there is marking that this is one idea separate from this next idea. And this is in the graphic facilitators guide, and when teaching graphic recording 101 with Lynn Carruthers, in the essential 8, text is number 1, bullets is number 2. Now, a lot of people might turn up their nose at bullets, but they have a good function. And maybe you get to a point where you're like, no, I'm already onto lines and connectors. Like, I don't need bullets. But that's what the function of bullets is. 1, separate one point from another. 2, it can be actually describing what that particular bullet is. So folks who do bullet journaling, like that's a really simple system of having at a fraction of a moment, you can recognize that task is complete. That task is moving to the next day because you're using consistent bullets. It can be you're only flagging certain items to highlight them, to draw attention. So, this is kind of that like, well, a bullet is a bullet, right? But man, how many pages did I write about that? Because there is actually more nuance than people might first think.
Yeah. And this is on page 117 and 118, by the way, if you're following along. So Brandy, do you have a favorite flag or a bullet that you use?
10 pages. I just had to count how many pages are in the flag chapter. No, I mean, I very often am making kind of like what look like neural networks with lines, and so basically I have a line that like will end in a dot. That's just part of what I personally like to use. But for sure, for my own note taking, I do a lot of what you see on page 118, where it's like I'm going to quickly make a book icon, like this is a book I want to look up, or this is a site I want to visit. So a lot of these are things that I'll use, but it's a tool there when I need that kind of tool.
Thank you.
Now we're getting to color, huh?
Well, so here's the thing. I wanted to get your permission on something. I really want to like go back and like color this in, because this was a little, I know it's like, it's my book, but it's your book, right? Like I don't want to go and do that. So this was, I mean, it was, I just think it'd be a little bit, I need to see this in color in order to make this work. Because I know you had something in your head when you were doing this one, right? Like this kind of thing. Like what were these things when they started, Were they always like gray, light gray, and dark gray, or were these supposed to be like green, yellow, blue? What was going on there with these?
I think that's in the text.
Navy suit,
pastel
briefcase.
I was thinking like pink, red, and like ox blood.
Okay, I'm writing that.
in those particular guys.
All right,
Yeah.
cool. So pink. Now I'm gonna go back and color these guys. Oxblood. I can imagine just like conversations with the publisher. Can I have just this one chapter in color, you know?
Well, that's, I mean, I'm self-published print on demand.
Oh yeah?
That is, if you, for over 400 pages, I haven't actually counted, but out of 400 pages, maybe 20 would have been more useful in color, but that's the only pages that really needed in the book. And I wanted a book that people could afford.
Yeah.
So exactly. Rachel's right on. When you said I want to color that page, I made it look like a coloring book so you could color it in
Nice. Okay, so permission is given. I'll go do that now.
completely.
Okay, so this next one is really cool. The buffer, which is something that like it's not really talked about a whole lot because again, you know, sometimes you get on Instagram and after just bruising your ego, you know, you see that a lot of these charts that are out there, they're just crammed full of stuff, you know. And so having that negative space, you call it the breathing space, right? I really love
Yep.
that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
You know, definitely the parallel was it John Cage who, oh, I know John Cage made pieces of music with silence. But it's definitely the, you know, we understand what the musical notes are because of the silences. I know that's something that gets often quoted, but this is the visual equivalent, is having that breathing space around things so we can see like the sibling, uh, maybe conjoined twins are the buffer and the cluster. So
Right.
the cluster is you're grouping similar things together. So there's less space between the items within that cluster, but then you have a big enough buffer to understand that this is one cluster, this is another cluster, this is another cluster. So it very much is that breathing space. And by making those spaces, we are making meaning because we are able to see where the patterns are more clearly.
Yeah. I mean, I just get when I see something like this, I just start getting stressed out, you know.
Totally.
To me, this is just a lot more restful to find a space there. So
Yep.
Brandy, we're coming up on time. If you want to go a little bit later, we can. I do want to give you a little bit of time just to talk about some of the things you've got coming up.
Mhm. I'm good with more. I thought I had 90, I thought this was 90 minutes, so I have the time.
Yes, and do you have any like events that you'd like to talk about?
So I will say, just that one thing we just had Envision, which is my annual 3-day nerd fest for visual thinkers. And because there's been a lot of questions about ways to learn with me, I am Thursday morning doing what I call a Brandyland tour, for lack of a better name. It's a completely no pressure session that if you have questions about courses, questions about the books, anything, you can ask. Because my thing is, I teach one thing, it's one very complex thing, and I have a lot of different ways to learn it. So I never want confusion to get in the way of somebody learning or strengthening their visual thinking skills. Awesome. Thank you, Brian. So that's on Thursday morning at 10 a.m. Chicago time. Absolutely welcome anyone. Again, it's informational, just truly just what questions do you have? What is it you're trying to work on next? And I can point you towards something I offer, maybe something somebody else offers. But very much a lot of that is around reducing, again, how we go into a deliberate practice so we can reduce the amount of attention something needs in the moment because we practice it so beautifully that it becomes automatic, that it becomes second nature.
Yeah.
The second thing, we do have this, I don't even have a registration page up yet, that's happening tomorrow, is we are having a deep dive day on November 12th. That's called Meaningful Mascots, and that is very much about faces and figures in your visual thinking. I always recommend Vocablo for folks who want a very beautiful, systematic way of learning icons. I very actively de-emphasize imagery because I think we get into a translation issue where too much of our attention is caught up in that. And the number one thing I teach, the first thing I teach, it was part of the Essential 8, faces. Maybe give them some bodies, but that is the first type of imagery I recommend people use. So that is November 12th. Just message me if you want.
Well, thanks for that.
If you message me, I'll send you the link when the link is ready.
Thanks for that. I dropped the link for the other one in the chat, so you can check that one out. Okay, can we do a couple more ideas here? And you're right, we're on for 90 minutes. So the banner, now here's the thing that I really wanted to jump to because this is cool, seen this, very nice. And then all of a sudden, like this like negative space banner before, right? And so this is like where you go to the magician, like, how do you do that? Like literally, how do you do that? I mean, that is just so cool. What's your process for it? Do you draw like a pencil line first, or do you just hit it?
Brian. That's why I get paid the big bucks.
All right. Okay, fine. Not going to share, are you?
No, it truly is practice. It's just practice. It happens to be that I know some folks have already heard this before, but one of the things that really imprinted on my brain very young is this Italian cartoon called La Linea. I always forget the man's name who drew it. Forgive me.
It's
It was
Mauro something. Yeah, I know it. Hang on. Let me look it up.
Cal, yeah, I don't even want to butcher it. So this was a cartoon of, when you see it, you're going to be like, oh yeah, that's totally Brandy's guy, right? Like the DNA from seeing that when I was a kid. We had a show in the US called The Great Space Coaster, and they licensed the kid safe cartoons because they're not all kid safe. Thank you. Oswaldo Cavandilo, Doli. Sorry, that was terribly Americanized and Midwestern. So that was something that imprinted really young. So I have always loved continuous line. I've always loved negative space. And I draw, I was the kid who never stopped drawing. So when I fell into this work when I was 22, specifically, drawing for a group of people as a graphic facilitator, I already had a ton of experience drawing in that way. So my answer is yes. What I do is I draw the outline and then I fill it in. And it's sometimes the lines are kind of weird. Sometimes the spacing's weird. I believe that as long as a line is drawn boldly and confidently, if it's a little wonky, nobody's going to have a problem. So that really is just drawn like as is. Oh, he's getting serious with the headphones.
Well, it's that my dog has this thing against the Amazon delivery guy. So there you go.
Oh,
yeah.
Got it.
Well, thanks for sharing
Got
that.
it.
You can still hear me okay, right?
Yeah, totally.
All right, cool. All right. So I'm on page 186. I'll try to get better at naming the pages. The connector. Okay. So I love everything that's going on here. This is like I'm picking up some Ed Emberley vibes, with these happy little dots. But then
Totally.
just for the catalog, for all of the different lines that you can have here, I haven't seen as good a compilation of all of these different lines in one place before. So this was just as a resource, like this is something I'm gonna keep this with me on a card for sure.
Nice.
But tell me about the connectors, just because this one was another one was so cool.
Yeah, thank you. My hope, Ed Emberley's right on. I talk about Ed. My dad was an amazing artist. He was also a really big jerk. And so I consider Ed Emberley my second drawing dad, who was way more fun than my dad. So Ed Emberley is right on. There's certain pages, like you had those 2 pages of the of all that lettering open, or later in the book, there's lots of little tiny icons. This page, these are all the kind of pages that when I was a kid, I was a total library nerd. So I would be the kid like scouring through, this is the nerdiest thing. My best friend growing up was our encyclopedia at home. And my favorite thing ever were like the layered diagrams.
The layered diagrams of like the body in the back. Yeah. Would you have like a World Book encyclopedia?
We had Colliers. We were a Colliers family. Thank you, Joel. Glad you're with me there. And so one of the best things ever is when you're flipping through books and you find those like double page spreads that are just like I just want to live here for a while. So I'm kind of getting the sense that might be, what you're feeling, Brian. And there's definitely part of what I was trying to, infuse in different places in the book. We're like, I gotta, dive in and explore these pages. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I love just the meaning that you also associate with it, right? Like the idea of connection, and then you get a strong connection, and then a weak connection, and then a dotted line for the potential connection. And I love the idea of incorporating like other symbols into this. So like the question mark, and then there's like the circuitous, I'm almost imagining like, Billy's pathway in the family circus. I thought that was my favorite one, where it was always just like one big picture and all the things that Billy did. And then like disconnection, which is like, now we're getting into almost like electrical engineering type, diagrams and symbols and things like that. So it's just really, really cool as a way of saying, you can take all of that stuff that you've got as part of your visual vocabulary and bring that into the work. Yeah.
And truly, I mean, the idea, the definition of the connector is when you're showing a relationship between 2 ideas, draw a line between them.
Right.
And you have a lot of choices in how you draw that line. Now you could have drawing after drawing that's only one type of line because that's all you needed. But maybe you're working on, it's kind of like the color thing, like this line has one job, so I only need this one line. But let's say I'm drawing something out and then I'm working on future things. And I'm like, no, I want a dotted line for that because this isn't a solid line yet. Right. So then we're giving a different type of line, different kind of job within the drawing. So, it's not that every drawing has all of those. They're just tools in the toolbox, but like one of the absolute most basic and most useful thing is draw a line between two ideas and show the relationship.
Speaking of the jobs that lines do, I'm wondering, so I'm on page 190. This one looks really, really personal to me. Can you talk about this drawing?
Yep. So this was, again, creating these stories at the end of each chapter that really help show a real world application for how the heck can we use these tools. And in this case, I'm using a story of a woman named Sue who is just spread too thin. Everyone has demands on her time. She doesn't like, I like to say, like, she doesn't feel her own center of gravity. She doesn't know where her edges are. So she sits down and makes this diagram of who are in her circles, and she's using placement. So she's choosing like how close or how far away are these individuals. She's also using different types of connector lines to show what those relationships are like. In some cases, you'll see like it's a certain kind of line going one way and a different kind of line going the other. And when I do teach this in my I have a set of 4 guided exercises called Draw in Your New Year, and this is called the social map. And it is really personal. When I talk about this map, I say that you may get a whole heck of a lot of out of this, and this may not be a drawing you want sitting around. Mm-hmm. And you might notice as you're making the drawing, you're feeling a lot of feelings because all that stuff you hold in, by making it tangible, by getting it on the page, stuff's going to come up. Like, I think a lot of folks are like, I could never do this drawing because I don't want to feel anything bad about anybody. It's like, these are your legitimate experiences. And this is a way of mapping out these relationships so you can get that little bit of distance, that little bit of a perspective. So definitely, I would say that's probably the most personal, not personally personal to me. I don't know that I've ever, trying to think if I've ever actually done this one. Maybe I have, it's not coming to mind, but that it is, it's very much about your actual relationships and assessing them and seeing like, oh, I don't like those lines.
Yeah.
Now there might be lines you can't control, or they might be lines. So the next page is she makes this layer of the drawing first and then makes marks on top of it. How would she like those relationships to change? So it really is being used as a tool to assess where you're at. Excellent. Rachel's done a version of that. That's awesome.
Yeah, I was happy to see a few of these things. So on the one hand, the line coming from the sister but was thick, going away was thin. So it's sort of like, okay, am I getting a lot from my sister, but what am I giving her in return? And so what she offers here is gratitude for that, right? I noticed that the hubby was way out and kind of disconnected. And so there's the idea of like, well, we need to reconnect. And then this one where I'm putting a lot into Sunday school, but not getting a whole lot out. It's like, okay, I need to train others to take over. So it sounded like this was, it wasn't just cathartic. It was also, coaching. This is something that I need to do for myself to improve where I'm at. Exactly. Heather's got a question in chat. Brandy, you have a handout in the AGME course that helps us determine our style. My mind is blown away by that exercise. Can you please remind me which day /module/day that is? I want to print it out again.
Are you
it's like a spider graph. It's got like 6 or 8. It's like what no, I'm wrong. I'm absolutely wrong. It's the hand with the 6 circles. Different circles. Yeah. The huge Venn diagram.
I think that if I have to guess, it's around day. I don't have
like one of the later ones. That's okay, yeah, but it's part of the flow part where we're integrating everything.
I think it's the second topic in flow. It's called fluency and influences, or influences and fluency.
Yeah, is the name. That's right. One. Yeah, I just wanted to draw attention to that because that's one of the things going into meaningful mascots is like, what is it that's really influencing my work? And I love hearing you talking about Ed Emberley. I love hearing you talking about the lineman, all of those. And I'd love to hear, I just think it's just blows me away. And eventually I'd love to hear from other people in the group what inspired them. Because I know Brian, Brian's like Picasso. He's been through several different styles. And Brandy, you've stuck to your aesthetic, really.
Mhm.
It's strong.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks.
You know,
Yeah.
looking
anyone-
at this with a little bit of space, I'm wondering, have you ever come across family constellations and constellation work? Which can be really, really
I-
heavy. Like to me, this is still pretty heavy, but it's not that heavy. You know, it's like if you're working with somebody, one of the rules is you never take somebody to a place where you can't bring them back from. Like if they're not quite ready for the constellation, I could see like doing something like this would be really valuable.
Yeah. I haven't experienced it firsthand, but I've heard amazing things about it.
Yeah. So speaking
Yeah.
of those like 2-page spreads where you're like, oh yeah, so here's another one. So I had it on my to-do list. I was gonna do like this like, big gallery of just all of the different arrows that you come up with. And I'm reading your book. I'm like, well, now I don't need to. Brandy's already done that. So so arrows, right?
Yep.
I got to tell you, I have a love-hate relationship with arrows, mostly because I do a lot of work with engineers, and they want to put double-ended arrows on everything, which to me sort of like, it kind of loses a bit of its meaning. It's like, no, what is that thing that's going back and forth? So
Yep.
that aside, arrows just can be, look at all the stuff you can do with them. So talk to me a little bit about arrows.
I'm such a nerd for this that in the green book, the graphic facilitator's guide, I literally drew a picture of me with my arm around an arrow. Like, here's
Aw.
my best friend, the arrow. So silly, but that's what you can do when you self-publish. You can follow a whim like that. Really, the thing with arrows is one, use them when you need an arrow.
Mhm.
So I can kind of imagine what you're talking about, Brian, is if there's arrows everywhere, like if everything is a double-ended arrow, no double-ended arrow has meaning, right? And what I love about arrows is they're so good at representing action and movement and verbs and lots of abstract verbs that, again, I don't tend to get super into what is the right icon for this, but I can tell you there's so many process conversations that are well served with a whole lot of stuff you see on those 2 pages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is really
Yep.
cool. And I love just even arrows as like layouts almost, right? Like going beyond just the connecting of one thing to the next thing to say, no, you can actually, like something like this, you could design an entire graphic against that to say, what are the things that are
Yep.
coming above and below? How do these things reinforce each other or
Exactly.
oppose each other, right?
Exactly.
So here's another one, and I'm on page 215 and 216. I just love the collections of things that you've got in here. I was just talking about these dynamics to somebody earlier today, and we were talking about the
Awesome.
need to, switch it up from just a plenary conversation. And I was trying to make the cases like, look, the longer you keep people in any one of these modalities, they're going to get tired. You got to switch this
Yep.
up. So what was great about this is I could say it doesn't just have to be chalk and talk, right? It doesn't just have to be the sage on the stage. Look at all these other things that we can do.
Totally.
So let's see, this is the postage stamp one, right?
Oh,
Uh,
that's actually in the flow.
oh, is it? I'm sorry. Let me
Yep.
back up.
That's all good. And that'll probably become a deck at some point too, because that would be a really
There it is, the flow. You're
useful
right. Same
planning.
thing as
Yep.
the arrows. So if you would, could you talk a little bit about this section, right? The flow at work, these different kind of dynamics that are here.
It really is taking that in the room experience of designing an event and using dots to represent people and using arrows to create movement to just get that overview of what are the types of experiences are we creating for this group. And so on those page 250 and 216 you see here, it's examples of, World Cafe kind of feels like this. And, the breakout sessions feel kind of like this. And so it's that idea of now we have a visual and we can see kind of an aerial view of what this experience looks like. When I design Envision, I happen to use colors instead of these kind of symbols, but I have color coding where at a glance I can see this is when Brandy's sage on the stage. This is when folks are working on an interactive exercise. This is when I have a guest speaker. So like same principle. I'm using color as the code for that, but here it was just a matter of, let's take that higher level look at what we're doing and how can we mix things up and make sure people have a great experience.
Right. So what I love about this is that, like, yeah, if you know these processes, that's it. I want to show you this. So just focusing on the World Cafe, where you've got the table rounds, you've got the host that hangs around, which is that lighter, color dot, and then the rest of the people move
Totally.
around. So I don't know if she was looking at your book when she drew this, but I got to share this with you. You ready? So
Yeah.
Kelvy just drew the World Cafe process right up there in
That's
the
it.
corner. It's like, it's the same thing.
That's
So
it. That's
it's
the
like,
shape of it.
it's like, yeah, exactly. It's like, that's it. That's how you represent this stuff.
Totally.
All right,
Awesome.
cool. All right, so this one I'm on page 225 and 226. You can see that you were dead on when you said the 2-page spreads, right? Because that was the stuff that really hooked me. So
Totally.
this one was really cool. So we're getting into containers here, right?
Yep.
And so I've never really seen it laid out like this before. So most of the time when people present containers, it's just like, here's all the containers you can use, right? But you actually had a structure to this. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, you're giving away all the greatest hits, Brian.
I'm sorry, I'll stop.
No, I think that hopefully folks will want their own copy and keep learning from it. Yeah, it's I'm a systematic thinker. It's always about context. It's always about how the pieces fit together. And on the previous page, you can see, or 2 pages, the first page of the container, you can see, or there we go, that the most versatile containers on the right side of that spread. Those are, I joke about making the big bucks, like the amount of work I've done that are connectors and containers. And those are 4 types of containers that are my go-tos. I know what each one does. I know when I want to use each one. Great. Now the double page spread following that is just kind of like a little bit more nuance, a little more detail. But the idea is we're thinking about what is the, oh gosh, getting into squishy language. It's like, what is the energy of a particular shape? How stable is a shape? How formed or how squishy is a shape? And that's laying it out in sort of a, we use bubble shapes for thoughts because exactly. So the things higher up are more ephemeral because they're like thinner lines, dotted lines, like this is a possibility, not a reality yet. Towards the bottom of the page, this is something that's decided. Towards the left this is something that's not as concrete, and then towards the right side it kind of goes from not concrete, like squishy, to kind of like organic, to more geometric, and then kind of once you get into burst, it's a little bit more like the energy of the thing. If any of that made sense.
It makes perfect
Hopefully
sense.
that made sense.
No, it
Okay.
makes perfect sense. It's the same, I think is the same reason why the stuff that's a little bit more aspirational or visionary is up, right? And the stuff that's a little bit more concrete and data driven and planful, it's down, right? Like there's an orientation to these things. And I think I see that here to the same extent, right? Would you agree?
For sure. Totally.
Okay, cool.
Totally.
And I love how it's arranged that way. It's like, look, if you've got something that's, you kind of got this squishy idea, put it in a bubble, right? Or you got this thing, it's like, oh, this is really super exciting. We're going to put it in like a starburst like that. Or you've got like hard facts and data. We're going to put that in a box, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that shape, even just shape has meaning. Here's an
Absolutely.
anchor. We'll talk about, by the way, this is, I didn't mark this one. Something that's always impressed me about your work, and Heather just talked about how you've had a real consistent style. Like you look at a Brandy Agerbeck chart, it's like, okay, that's Brandy Agerbeck. I mean, you can see that a mile away, right? There's about 20 or 30 folks out there. I couldn't tell them apart, but that's clearly a Brandy thing. And one of the ones that I've noticed that is kind of a signature of yours is that you tend to put a big anchoring image like right there in the center, and it kind of radiates outward from that. Is that, is that something that, am I right there, or is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
it really
intentional,
is.
right?
Yes, it a lot of times that is a super useful shape. And it absolutely is the closest sibling to mind maps. I like to, I'm not at all anti mind map, and Tony Buzan's work is a fantastic gateway into this work. When people use mind maps in the Tony Buzan shape of mind maps, it's sort of like an exploded outline. So it's really just taking like a linear outline and shaping it around a hub, which is more spatial. Just a caveat of, I like having something in the center because you can go any direction out from that. For a lot of folks, that can feel really intimidating. Like, I could never start in the center. The thing is, like you saw on the previous page where I kind of drew a pie in the middle. Yeah, perfect.
Let me see if I can find a good example of it, but you keep talking.
Yeah.
So your classic Tony Buzan mind map looks kind of like this, right?
Yep.
And one of the things I
Exactly.
didn't really get is how his, let me just contrast, because I think this is a little bit more, this is the way that I do it, is I write the word and then I draw the line to connect the thing. So
Yep.
his way of doing it is to draw the line and then write the word along the line, which is just
Exactly.
problematic when you're trying to actually draw this thing. I don't know if you had the same experience, but
I
you
think
wind
that
yourself like
works.
twisting your arm up.
I think it works perfectly fine if it's that yellow corner where you're making the map for yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think if you're trying to do it on a piece of paper on the wall, it's totally awkward.
Yeah. You asked
So,
me to go back
totally.
a page, I think, right?
Oh yeah, just the that pie on the previous, or I guess a
Oh,
couple pages, the first page of the
this one
anchor.
here.
Yeah, you're basically making a rectangle, because most of us are drawing on rectangles. You're turning that rectangle into a pie with slices. So you start in the middle, and the great thing is that slice only gets bigger and wider as it goes out to the edges. So it's actually an incredibly forgiving shape. As long as you don't start with you're not taking up a huge amount of your space with the anchor, like that can get you in trouble when you're like,
Mhm.
look at this whole gorgeous ornate anchor, and now I don't have any room for anything else. Let's not do that. But definitely, like, it's actually a really forgiving shape. And I don't know if one part of the drawing, it's forgiving and flexible in the way that maybe like on the next page where I have the 1 through 6
Uh-huh.
numbers, like for instance, it might be maybe you do want to create more of a sequence from 1 to 2 to 3. Maybe that's not necessary. On one drawing, that number 2 section might be giant, and there's a whole lot of conversation around that part, but maybe only a couple points around 5. So, it's just really flexible. You're getting more space as you go out.
Yeah, I love it. By the way, let me just show you a couple of more of the Buzan style mind maps, right? I think these
Yep.
are a little bit more classic, I would say. And this came out in the 1990 is when he published this book. Yeah, love me some mind mapping, just to get my own thoughts out there. Okay.
Totally. Totally.
Love
Yeah,
your
I'm not
example of
anti-mind map. I just want folks to not get stuck in that shape
No, I've seen
if
you
they have
use it
ideas
before.
that don't fit the shape.
Yeah, for like
Okay.
a like divergent, for like facilitating a brainstorming session where you really need to draw those connections. Yeah, they're I think they're very useful.
Yep, for sure.
So I'm on page 250, the lasso, right? So I'm wondering, is that a reference to like the Photoshop tool, which is
No.
like not at all. It's just something. All right. So this is something I just wanted to, like, this thing right here, as I'm going through this, it's like, okay, I got bubbles. I do bubbles. I hadn't seen this before. And I was like, okay, that's cool, right? Just filling in the negative space, like just giving like the impression of the thing that's there. It's like Heather has this saying, it's like, when it's like the thing that you don't draw or don't connect, it makes people feel smarter because they do that in their own head. So just tell me about what's going on here. This is just so cool.
Yeah, it really is the way our brains fill in the spaces in between. So with something like that, that's actually Heather, can I ask a favor if you're at your computer? If you would uh search on my blog for the Wizard of Oz and add the link for that post, because I've got a really good example of it. If you're around, if not,
Or
no problem.
anybody. Now it's a race.
Yeah, exactly. Loosetooth.com, and then there's a link to blog, and then if you search for Wizard of Oz, you'll see. I'll try. Thank you, Heather. Not to put you on the spot because your video is off or was off. That really was the top one. The idea with the lasso, so similar to the cluster and the buffer being siblings, the lasso and the anchor are siblings. The anchor is you're starting with a center of gravity. The lasso is when you're making emergent clusters, you're figuring stuff out, you're putting groupings together. I got to be careful not to only use my own language. It's definitely a vernacular, where you see a cluster emerge, and then you're like, I want to make this cluster even more apparent. So I'm making a larger container around a grouping of points. That's the principle of the lasso. And that bottom one, it really is that we can still understand that as 3 groupings on that page. We don't have to complete the lines.
Right. Love it. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm going to, just as a heads up, we've got just a few minutes left. I'm going to open it up for questions. You can drop something in the chat if you want. If you want to come off mute, that's fine. So this was just another one that I wanted to touch on, which is the fill, right? And to me, this one, it's an idea shaper. It's also like a really like clearly a drawing technique, right? Like going through the difference between stippling and hatching and cross hatching. And so tell me kind of, and I love like the this, because it's now like, okay, I see what you're getting at here, and now I really see what you're getting at here by applying it versus not, right? So tell me about the choice to include this in particular as an idea shaper, right? Because this one of the other ones, this one seemed to be like really about like drawing technique.
Mhm. This is the principle of creating more depth in the page. So I like to think about when I'm making it's amazing how much information a drawing can hold. And I think of it as levels and layers. So
Mm.
levels of information will come later with the pyramid and scale. That's when you can see like I've got a main idea and there's 5 points, and then each of these points has supporting points. So that's levels and hierarchy. And then I also like to think about layers of information, which is more about the depth on the page. So the two that really hit that principle is the trio and then the fill.
Mhm.
You can absolutely make drawings that don't have the fill in them. I know for me, and I know this does come more easily to me because I had lots of drawing experience, lots of fine art experience before I fell into the job title graphic facilitation. But it's that idea that instead of looking at a drawing, like that rabbit example on the left-hand side, you can tell there's a couple different colors used, but the line that makes the word rabbit and the line that draws the rabbit and the lines that make the boxes and those little square bullet point flags and the words, they're all the same basic type of line. So our brain is sort of sorting out like what is a connector line versus a container line versus a piece of text.
Mhm.
One thing I really like about fill, I also like about scaling line thickness, is it helps orient and create different, it creates depth, but it also creates different types of lines. So I can understand that, that word rabbit is distinctly different than other types of text on the page.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you, because this was actually something I was going to ask you this, but then I ruled it out because I thought it was too geeky. As I look at your stuff, a lot of it, I was wondering if you are intentionally monoline, if you use like the round nib markers. No, just the chisel. You're just very careful about how you're holding the chisel tip. Okay.
Just a lot of control, a lot of practice.
Yeah, because it looks
Yep.
monoline to me. You're just very intentional about that.
Yep. I
Cool.
mean, that specific drawing might be monoline because it was a
Mhm.
smaller scale drawing.
Yeah.
I mean, when I'm working at charts, it's always chisel tip. When I'm working my own drawings, Papermate flares all day, every
Wow.
day. And then I just draw thicker lines. Yeah.
Heather introduced me to these guys. These are a lot of fun. All
Yep.
right. Cool.
Yep.
So I want to open it up to others. And so if you want
Please.
to, go ahead and come off mute, or find your way into chat. Um, by the way, I just thought this was another one of I love your full page spreads. I think we've covered that at this point. Just to the contrast here, this really like the storyboard that happens. And I
Yep.
think this is an example of a postage stamp, right? Which is another one.
Yes.
So
Yep.
talk about the postage stamp, because I hadn't heard of that one before.
Yeah.
What's the postage stamp?
The postage stamp is, I was just seeing, sorry to lead you guys astray with that Wizard of Oz example. I really thought that one was published. Maybe we can add that
Oh, we'll
below the
find it. We'll
video
put it in the show
recording or
notes.
something. Yeah, there we go. Postage stamp. This is a bit like the visual. Well, it's definitely a parallel to, with the retort, we're distilling down our text into more concise phrases. Here, we're distilling down an image into something that's more symbolic and simplified. And really, I mean, part of it is about level of detail. Part of it is that it's just physically smaller on the page. In this particular example, it's the repetition. So the story here is Anne is trying to figure out where these headaches are coming from. She's got chronic headaches. She doesn't know what's going on. So she's using just a simple old little tiny spiral bound pocket sized, cheapy notebook from the drugstore. And each page is an instance of a headache. So she's using the same shape, that simple old star person representing her.
Mhm.
And she's also got a little line across the bottom. So that's kind of the simplified symbols that give her a shape to record her headaches. What kind of physical symptoms am I getting? The line helps her kind of like map it, like it came on strong and then petered out, talk about the length. So it's really that simplifying the shape and repeating the shape is a great way to track things. That's not the only way to use a postage stamp, but that's what that story's telling.
Love it. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, we are just about right up until the end, and I want to give others a chance to weigh in. And just I'll just thumb through some of my other favorite pages while people are coming off mute or finding their way in. You know,
Awesome.
here's the integrator, which we didn't get a chance to talk about. This one was just super cool. I got a lot out of this. Thank you for putting this out into the world.
Thank you.
And I think we'll
Happy
go ahead and
to.
do it this way. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but before I do, can we give Brandy a big Nova Scribes thank you for being here? Thank you, Brandy. Yay.
You're
nice
welcome.